When Nazi Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, millions of German soldiers found themselves facing an uncertain future. These men, who had fought across Europe, Africa, and the Soviet Union, now stood on the precipice of judgment. Some were high-ranking officers who had commanded armies and shaped the course of the war. Others were ordinary soldiers who had followed orders in the Wehrmacht or the infamous Waffen SS. But what became of them after the guns fell silent? How did the victorious Allies handle the massive task of processing millions of former enemy combatants? Would justice be served, or would pragmatism and politics determine their fates? From the courtrooms of Nuremberg to the prisoner of war camps scattered across Europe, from quiet villages in Bavaria to distant shores in South America, the stories of these men reveal the complex and often contradictory nature of post-war justice. Some would face the hangman's noose for their crimes against humanity. Others would spend decades in Soviet labor camps. Many would simply walk free, their wartime actions forgotten or forgiven in the rush to rebuild a shattered Europe. In this video, we will find out. So, without further ado, let's start with the first name on our list. Walther von Brauchitsch followed in the footsteps of his military ancestors, building a career in the German army that would ultimately see him rise to one of its highest positions. Born into a Prussian military family in Berlin on October 4, 1881, Brauchitsch seemed destined for the officer corps from birth. His father had been a general, and young Walther absorbed military traditions from his earliest years. He joined the Prussian army in 1900 and quickly demonstrated the tactical acumen and organizational skills that would mark his ascent through the ranks. During World War I, Brauchitsch served primarily as a staff officer, gaining valuable experience in the intricacies of military planning and logistics. These skills would serve him well in the interwar period, when the Treaty of Versailles had reduced the German military to a skeleton force. Brauchitsch navigated the restricted environment of the Weimar Republic's Reichswehr with political savvy, advancing steadily while many of his contemporaries stagnated. His expertise in artillery tactics caught the attention of senior commanders, and by the time Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, Brauchitsch had already established himself as one of the army's rising stars. In February 1938, Hitler appointed him commander-in-chief of the German army, replacing Werner von Fritsch in a calculated purge designed to bring the military more firmly under Nazi control. Brauchitsch's tenure as commander-in-chief was marked by stunning early successes that would later give way to catastrophic failures. He oversaw the planning and execution of the Blitzkrieg campaigns that swept through Poland in September 1939, demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of combined arms warfare. The world watched in shock as German panzers, supported by Stuka dive bombers and mechanized infantry, crushed Polish resistance in just over a month. In May 1940, Brauchitsch directed the invasion of France and the Low Countries, employing bold operational concepts that sent German armoured columns racing through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest. The fall of France in June 1940 represented the pinnacle of Brauchitsch's military career, earning him accolades throughout Nazi Germany and fear throughout the world. However, beneath the surface of these triumphs lay a fundamental weakness that would prove fatal to his command. Brauchitsch increasingly found himself unable to resist Hitler's interference in operational military decisions. The Führer's growing confidence after the victories in Poland and France led him to overrule his generals with increasing frequency, and Brauchitsch lacked the political courage or personal authority to push back effectively. This dynamic became disastrous during Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union that began on June 22, 1941. Brauchitsch had harboured doubts about the campaign from the start, recognising the immense logistical challenges of conquering such vast territories. But he acquiesced to Hitler's determination to destroy the Soviet state before Britain could be defeated. As German forces drove deep into Soviet territory during the summer and fall of 1941, Brauchitsch found himself caught between the military realities on the ground and Hitler's increasingly unrealistic demands. The campaign that Hitler had promised would be over in weeks dragged into months, with German supply lines stretched to the breaking point and Soviet resistance stiffening. By November 1941, as German forces approached Moscow in the face of the brutal Russian winter, Brauchitsch's health began to fail under the immense stress. On November 10th, he suffered a serious heart attack, physically manifesting the psychological toll of his impossible position. Less than a month later, when Operation Typhoon, the final push to capture Moscow, ground to a halt in the face of Soviet counterattacks and temperatures dropping below -40 degrees, Hitler found his scapegoat. On December 19, 1941, Brauchitsch was relieved of his command, with Hitler himself assuming the role of Commander-in-Chief of the German army. For the remainder of the war, Brauchitsch lived in a state of forced retirement on his estate, marginalized and forgotten as younger, more politically reliable officers took center stage. He watched from the sidelines as the war he had helped launch spiraled into catastrophe. The once mighty Wehrmacht ground down in the frozen steppes of Russia and the deserts of North Africa. The end of the war in May 1945 brought a dramatic reversal of fortune for the former field marshal. In August 1945, British occupation forces arrested Brauchitsch at his home and transported him to internment. He was held in custody, as Allied prosecutors prepared cases against high-ranking Nazi military leaders. The charges against Brauchitsch were serious and numerous, encompassing his role in planning aggressive wars, his command responsibility for war crimes committed by forces under his authority, and his participation in the criminal conspiracy that was the Nazi regime. Brauchitsch spent 3 years in Allied custody, moving between detention facilities as investigators built their case. His health, already compromised by his 1941 heart attack, deteriorated further under the stress of imprisonment and the prospect of trial. By 1948, it had become clear that Brauchitsch would face prosecution in one of the subsequent Nuremberg trials, focusing on the German High Command. But fate intervened before justice could be served. On October 18, 1948, just days before he was scheduled to stand trial, Walther von Brauchitsch died of pneumonia in a Hamburg military hospital. He was 67 years old, his death raised uncomfortable questions about accountability and justice in the post-war period. Here was a man who had commanded the invasion of multiple countries, who had overseen military operations that resulted in millions of deaths, who had received substantial financial rewards from the Nazi regime for his service, yet he would never face judgment in a court of law. The practical difficulties of this outcome troubled many who sought comprehensive accountability for Nazi crimes. Brauchitsch's legacy remains deeply ambiguous, remembered by some military historians as a capable tactician, undone by a toxic political environment, and by others as a willing participant in Nazi aggression, who simply lacked the moral courage to resist Hitler's criminal orders. Karl Donitz represented a different face of the German military leadership, one rooted in naval tradition, rather than the army's Prussian heritage. Born on September 16, 1891, in the Berlin suburb of Grunau, Donitz joined the Imperial German Navy in 1910 and quickly found his calling in the dangerous world of submarine warfare. During World War I, he served as a U-boat commander in the Mediterranean, where he learned firsthand the devastating potential of submarines against merchant shipping. His U-boat was sunk in October 1918, and Donitz spent the final months of the war as a prisoner of the British, an experience that left him with a burning desire to perfect submarine tactics. During the interwar years, Donitz became one of the Navy's foremost advocates for U-boat warfare, developing the tactical concepts that would later terrorize Allied shipping in the Atlantic. When Hitler began secretly rebuilding Germany's submarine fleet in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, Donitz was placed in command of the U-boat arm in 1935. He developed the Wolfpack tactic, whereby groups of submarines would coordinate attacks on Allied convoys, overwhelming their escorts through sheer numbers and simultaneous strikes from multiple directions. When war broke out in September 1939, Donitz's U-boats immediately went on the offensive against British shipping. From 1939 to early 1943, German submarines dominated the Battle of the Atlantic, sinking millions of tons of Allied shipping and threatening to cut Britain's vital supply lines to North America. Donitz, promoted to Grand Admiral in 1943 after the death of Erich Ritter, presided over what he would later call the happy time for U-boat crews, when Allied anti-submarine defences were still developing and German submarines enjoyed tactical superiority. However, May 1943 marked a decisive turning point when improved Allied technology, including radar, sonar, long-range aircraft and code-breaking capabilities, suddenly turned the hunter into the hunted. U-boat losses skyrocketed as Allied countermeasures became increasingly effective. Despite mounting evidence that the U-boat campaign had become unsustainable, Donitz continued to send young crews to Almost certain death in obsolete submarines, driven by a combination of naval tradition, personal loyalty to Hitler, and ideological fanaticism. His unwavering commitment to National Socialism set him apart from many Wehrmacht officers who maintained a certain distance from Nazi ideology. Donitz enthusiastically embraced Nazi racial theories and frequently exhorted his men to fight with ideological fervour. In a speech to naval officers in 1944, he declared that the Navy must be a model of ideological conviction. This political reliability, combined with his reputation as a capable administrator, led Hitler to make an extraordinary decision in the final days of the Third Reich. In his political testament written hours before his suicide on April 30, 1945, Hitler named Donitz as his successor as head of state. This appointment thrust Donitz into the centre of history's final chapter of Nazi Germany. Donitz formed what became known as the Flensburg government, a rump administration that exercised nominal authority over the rapidly shrinking territory still under German control. For 23 bizarre days, from May 1st to May 23, 1945, Donitz served as Reich President and Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. His primary accomplishment during this surreal interlude was overseeing the surrender of German forces to the Western Allies. On May 7, 1945, at his direction, General Alfred Jodel signed the unconditional surrender document at Reims, France, effectively ending the war in Europe. Donitz later claimed that he had dragged out the surrender process to allow as many German soldiers and civilians as possible to flee westward ahead of the advancing Soviet forces, though historians debate the extent to which this was true. On May 23, 1945, British forces arrested Donitz and his entire cabinet at Flensburg, bringing an end to the last vestige of Nazi authority. Donitz was transported to detention facilities and eventually to Nuremberg, where he would face trial as a major war criminal. At the International Military Tribunal, which sat from November 1945 to October 1946, Donitz faced serious charges. He was accused of conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and waging aggressive war crimes and crimes against humanity. The prosecution presented evidence of his enthusiastic support for Nazi ideology, his continuation of the U-boat campaign long after it had become militarily futile, and his role as Hitler's successor. Specific war crimes allegations focused on his January 1942 order that U-boats should not rescue survivors from ships they had sunk, which violated international maritime law and arguably constituted a war crime. The defence argued that similar practices had been employed by other nations, and that Donitz had acted as a naval commander following the customs of modern warfare. The tribunal's verdict reflected the complexity of judging military leaders for actions taken during wartime. Donitz was acquitted of crimes against humanity, with the court finding insufficient evidence that he had participated in the Holocaust or other atrocities against civilian populations. However, he was found guilty of crimes against peace and war crimes. On October 1, 1946, he was sentenced to 10 years' imprisonment in Spandau Prison in Berlin. This relatively lenient sentence, compared to the death penalties handed down to other defendants, reflected the court's recognition that Donitz's crimes, while serious, were primarily military in nature rather than genocidal. Donitz served his full sentence in Spandau, sharing the prison with other convicted Nazi leaders, including Albert Speer, Walther von Schirach, and Rudolf Hess. He was released on October 1, 1956, after serving exactly 10 years. Unlike many former Nazi leaders who expressed contrition for their role in the regime's crimes, Donitz remained largely unrepentant. He relocated to the small town of Aumühle, near Hamburg, where he lived quietly but defiantly. In 1958, he published his memoirs titled Memoirs, 10 Years and 20 Days, a carefully crafted work that presented his version of events while minimizing his ideological commitment to Nazism and denying knowledge of the Holocaust. In the book, Donitz portrayed himself as a professional naval officer who had done his duty to his country, claiming he had been unaware of the regime's worst atrocities. This stance was consistent with what became known as the clean Wehrmacht myth, the false claim that the German military had fought honourably while remaining separate from the Nazi Party's criminal activities. Historians have thoroughly debunked this narrative, demonstrating the military's deep complicity in Nazi crimes. Donitz lived for more than 2 decades after his release, dying on December 24, 1980 at the age of 89 after a prolonged illness. To the end, he refused to acknowledge the criminal nature of the regime he had served so loyally, representing a particularly stubborn strain of historical denial that persisted among some former Nazi officials. His funeral attracted considerable controversy, with neo-Nazi groups attempting to turn it into a political demonstration, prompting German authorities to maintain a heavy police presence. Gerd von Rundstedt embodied the Prussian military aristocracy that had dominated the German army for generations. Born into an old Junker family on December 12, 1875, in Aschersleben, Rundstedt's military pedigree was impeccable. His family had produced soldiers for the Prussian crown for centuries, and young Gerd was raised in an atmosphere of military tradition and conservative values. He joined the army in 1892 and built a steady career through competence and connections. During World War I, Rundstedt served primarily as a staff officer, demonstrating the organizational abilities that would define his later career. In the chaotic years of the Weimar Republic, he navigated the political turbulence while climbing the ranks of the drastically reduced Reichswehr. By 1932, he had reached the rank of Colonel General, one of the highest positions in the severely limited German military of that era. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Rundstedt was initially skeptical of the new regime's radicalism, but his opposition remained muted and ultimately ineffectual. He valued his professional position too highly to risk it through overt political resistance. In October 1938, Rundstedt retired from active service, apparently content to end his career after nearly 5 decades in uniform. However, the outbreak of World War II in September 1939 drew him back into service. Hitler's regime needed experienced commanders for the massive expansion of the German military, and Rundstedt's tactical expertise and aristocratic bearing made him an ideal choice to lead Army Group South during the invasion of Poland. The Polish campaign demonstrated Rundstedt's capabilities as an operational commander, and he was subsequently given command of Army Group A for the invasion of France in May 1940. Under his leadership, German forces executed the daring thrust through the Ardennes that split the Allied armies and led to the stunning German victory. The fall of France represented Rundstedt's greatest military achievement and earned him promotion to Field Marshal on July 19, 1940. For the next 4 years, Rundstedt would command forces across Europe, from the frozen steppes of Russia to the beaches of Normandy, becoming one of Hitler's most relied-upon commanders, despite their frequently contentious relationship. In June 1941, Rundstedt led Army Group South in Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. His forces achieved spectacular early successes, encircling massive numbers of Soviet troops and advancing hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. However, as winter approached and Soviet resistance stiffened, Rundstedt began to grasp the impossibility of Hitler's strategic vision. When Soviet forces counterattacked near Rostov in November 1941, Rundstedt made the militarily sound decision to withdraw and consolidate his positions. Hitler furiously countermanded the order and relieved Rundstedt of command on December 1, 1941, the first in a series of dismissals and reinstatements that would mark their relationship. Yet Hitler could not afford to leave Rundstedt on the sidelines for long. In March 1942, he appointed Rundstedt Commander-in-Chief West, responsible for defending occupied France and the Low Countries against the anticipated Allied invasion. For more than 2 years, Rundstedt oversaw the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a massive system of fortifications stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. When the Allies finally landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, Rundstedt and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel were caught in an impossible strategic situation, forced to defend thousands of miles of coastline with insufficient mobile reserves and under the shadow of Allied air superiority. The days following D-Day revealed Rundstedt's growing disillusionment with Nazi Germany's prospects. As German forces struggled to contain the Allied beachhead, Rundstedt came to the grim realization that the war was lost. Following a failed counterattack near Caen on July 1, 1944, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel telephoned Rundstedt asking what should be done. Rundstedt's response became infamous. "Make peace, you fools! What else can you do?" This brutally honest assessment of Germany's military situation sealed his fate. The following day, July 2, 1944, Hitler relieved him of command for the second time, replacing him with Field Marshal Günther von Kluge. However, in a pattern that had become familiar, Hitler recalled Rundstedt to duty just 2 months later, in September 1944, once again appointing him Commander-in-Chief West after Kluge's dismissal and suicide. Rundstedt remained in this position through the final desperate months of the war, overseeing the failed Ardennes offensive in December 1944 and the disintegration of German defences in the west. Finally, in March 1945, as Allied armies crossed the Rhine and drove deep into Germany, Hitler dismissed Rundstedt for the third and final time. On May 1, 1945, the day after Hitler's suicide in his Berlin bunker, American troops from the 36th Infantry Division captured the 70-year-old field marshal. During his initial interrogation, the stress and exhaustion of the past months caught up with Rundstedt, and he suffered another heart attack. Allied authorities moved him between various detention facilities in Britain, first to Camp Ashcan in Luxembourg, then to camps in southern Wales and Suffolk. British prosecutors charged him with war crimes related to his command in the Soviet Union, particularly his alleged assistance with Field Marshal Walther von Reichenau's notorious Severity Order of October 1941, which had explicitly called for the harsh treatment of Soviet civilians and prisoners of war and had led to mass murders throughout the occupied territories. The charges carried the potential for execution if he were convicted. However, Rundstedt's deteriorating health and advanced age ultimately saved him from trial. By 1948, at 73 years old, he was suffering from severe cardiovascular disease and other ailments related to his years of military service and the stress of imprisonment. British authorities determined that he was medically unfit to stand trial. In July 1948, they released him from custody without prosecution. Rundstedt spent his remaining years at Schloss Oppershausen in Lower Saxony, living quietly in retirement. His health never recovered, and he remained plagued by heart conditions that required regular medical care. On February 24, 1953, at the age of 77, Rundstedt died of heart failure. His death came just months before many of his fellow field marshals and generals would face justice in the various post-war trials. Rundstedt's case illustrates one of the frustrating realities of post-war accountability. His poor health allowed him to escape prosecution for serious war crimes, leaving questions of justice unresolved. Albert Kesselring earned the affectionate nickname Smiling Albert from those who knew him, a moniker that seemed incongruous with the brutal campaigns he directed across multiple theatres of World War II. Born on November 30, 1885, in Markstedt, Bavaria, Kesselring originally trained as an army officer, but made a remarkable career transition in the mid-1930s, when he transferred to the newly formed Luftwaffe. This move proved fortuitous, as his organisational talents were perfectly suited to building a modern air force from scratch. By 1936, he had risen to the rank of lieutenant general and became chief of the general staff of the Luftwaffe, working directly under Hermann Göring to develop the tactical air doctrine that would support Germany's blitzkrieg strategy. When war erupted in 1939, Kesselring commanded air fleets during the invasions of Poland and France, coordinating close air support for ground forces with devastating effectiveness. His greatest challenge came during the Battle of Britain in 1940, when his Luftflotte II attacked British targets in southeastern England. Despite initial successes, the campaign ultimately failed to break British resistance or establish air superiority necessary for a German invasion. This failure taught Kesselring valuable lessons about the limits of air power, lessons he would apply in subsequent campaigns. In 1941, Hitler appointed Kesselring Commander-in-Chief South, responsible for coordinating German and Italian forces in the Mediterranean theatre. This assignment would define the remainder of his wartime career. When Allied forces invaded Sicily in July 1943, followed by landings on mainland Italy in September, Kesselring faced the daunting task of defending the Italian peninsula with limited resources against numerically superior Allied armies. His defensive strategy proved brilliantly effective, utilizing Italy's mountainous terrain to establish a series of fortified defensive lines that turned the Allied advance into a grinding war of attrition. The most famous of these defensive positions was the Gustav Line, anchored on the monastery of Monte Cassino, which held out against repeated Allied assaults for months. Kesselring's skilled defensive warfare delayed Allied victory in Italy for over a year and a half, tying down substantial forces that might otherwise have been deployed in France. However, this military success came at a terrible cost to Italian civilians. Kesselring issued orders for brutal anti-partisan operations and authorized massive reprisals against civilian populations suspected of supporting resistance fighters. In March 1945, as the Western Front collapsed, Hitler appointed Kesselring Commander-in-Chief West, replacing Rundstedt in a final desperate shuffle of commands. But by this point, Germany's defeat was inevitable, and Kesselring could do nothing to prevent Allied armies from pouring into Germany from all directions. On May 7, 1945, Kesselring surrendered the southern German forces to American troops, ending his active military career. Throughout his service, Kesselring remained steadfastly loyal to Hitler and the Nazi regime, never wavering in his support even as the war turned against Germany. In October 1945, Allied prosecutors called Kesselring as a witness in the initial Nuremberg trials, where his testimony provided insights into the German military's relationship with the Nazi leadership. But this was merely a prelude to his own reckoning with justice. In 1947, British military authorities brought Kesselring before a war crimes tribunal in Venice to answer for atrocities committed under his command in Italy. The specific charge that sealed his fate related to one of the war's most notorious massacres. On March 23, 1944, Italian partisans had attacked a German police unit in Rome, killing 33 soldiers. In retaliation, Kesselring authorized the execution of 335 Italian civilian hostages, who were murdered in the Ardeatine caves just outside Rome the following day. The victims, including 75 Jews, were shot and their bodies buried in the caves, which were then dynamited to conceal the crime. The massacre exemplified the brutal reprisal policies that characterized German occupation across Europe. During his trial, Kesselring's defense attempted to argue that the executions were a legitimate military response to partisan attacks, citing the laws of war as they were understood at the time. However, the prosecution successfully demonstrated that the scale of the reprisal far exceeded any justification, and that the victims had been randomly selected civilians rather than captured partisans. On May 6, 1947, the tribunal found Kesselring guilty and sentenced him to death by firing. Squad. The verdict seemed to ensure that Kesselring would face the ultimate penalty for his crimes. However, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment following widespread appeals, including interventions from Churchill and other British political figures who argued for leniency. The commutation sparked controversy, with many questioning whether political considerations had trumped justice. Kesselring served his sentence in various British military prisons until October 1952, when he was pardoned and released due to declining health. He was 66 years old and suffering from cancer and heart disease. After his release, rather than retiring quietly, Kesselring became actively involved in German veterans associations, often speaking at reunions and writing memoirs that downplayed Nazi crimes and promoted the clean Wehrmacht myth. His autobiography, published in the 1950s, portrayed German forces as honourable soldiers who had fought bravely against overwhelming odds while remaining ignorant of the regime's worst atrocities. This narrative found a receptive audience among former Wehrmacht personnel and some segments of West German society eager to rehabilitate the military's reputation. Kesselring died on July 16, 1960, having never expressed genuine remorse for the crimes committed under his command, or acknowledged the moral bankruptcy of the regime he had served so enthusiastically. His case represents one of the troubling patterns in post-war justice. A high-ranking commander directly responsible for war crimes, who ultimately escaped execution and lived out his final years as a free man, contributing to historical revisionism rather than truth and reconciliation. Erich von Manstein, born Erich von Lewinsky on November 24, 1887 in Berlin, was widely regarded by military historians as one of World War II's most skilled operational commanders. Adopted by his uncle and aunt after his father's death, young Erich took the Manstein surname and inherited a military legacy that stretched back generations. He joined the Prussian army in 1906 and served as a staff officer during World War I, where he developed the analytical skills and strategic thinking that would later distinguish his career. During the interwar years, Manstein remained in the Reichswehr, steadily advancing through peacetime assignments that honed his expertise in military planning. When Hitler began rebuilding the German military in the mid-1930s, Manstein's talents came to the forefront. His most significant contribution to German military strategy came in the winter of 1939 to 1940, when he devised the operational plan that would lead to Germany's stunning victory over France. While the German High Command initially favoured a cautious approach similar to the Schlieffen Plan of World War I, Manstein proposed a daring alternative. Send the main German armoured thrust through the Ardennes forest, traditionally considered impassable to tanks, to split the Allied armies and encircle their best divisions. His superiors initially rejected this audacious plan as too risky, but Manstein persistently advocated for it through unofficial channels. Eventually, his ideas reached Hitler, who enthusiastically embraced the concept. The plan's success in May 1940, when German panzers burst through the Ardennes and reached the English Channel in just 10 days, vindicated Manstein's strategic vision and established his reputation as a military innovator. In June 1940, following the French campaign, Hitler promoted Manstein to full general in recognition of his intellectual contribution to Germany's greatest military triumph. When Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, began on June 22, 1941, Manstein commanded the 56th Panzer Corps as part of Army Group North. His forces drove rapidly through the Baltic states toward Leningrad, coming tantalizingly close to capturing the city before Soviet resistance and logistical constraints forced a halt. Hitler then transferred Manstein to the southern sector of the Eastern Front, where he took command of the 11th Army in September 1941. Over the next year, Manstein demonstrated his operational brilliance in a series of successful campaigns. His forces destroyed massive Soviet formations, capturing 430,000 prisoners during operations in the Crimea. His most celebrated achievement came in July 1942, when his army captured the heavily fortified city of Sevastopol after a grueling siege lasting nearly 8 months. This success earned him promotion to Field Marshal, the youngest German officer to achieve that rank during the war. However, Manstein's military successes on the Eastern Front were inseparable from the horrific war crimes committed by forces under his command. The 11th Army cooperated extensively with SS Einsatzgruppen death squads, providing logistical support and sometimes direct assistance for mass executions of Jews and other perceived enemies of the Reich. Manstein later claimed ignorance of these atrocities, but documentary evidence proved that he was regularly briefed on anti-partisan operations and the activities of security forces in his rear areas. In November 1942, as the Battle of Stalingrad reached its climax, Hitler appointed Manstein to command Army Group Don with orders to relieve the encircled 6th Army trapped in the city. Manstein organized Operation Winterstorm in December 1942, a desperate attempt to break through Soviet lines and rescue the surrounded German forces. His relief force came within 30 miles of Stalingrad before being halted by fierce Soviet resistance and overwhelming numerical superiority. The failure of this operation sealed the fate of the 6th Army, which surrendered in February 1943 in one of the war's most catastrophic German defeats. Despite this setback, Manstein achieved what many considered his finest operational performance in February and March 1943, when he orchestrated the recapture of Kharkov following the Stalingrad disaster. Using mobile warfare tactics and taking advantage of overextended Soviet forces, he stabilized the southern sector of the Eastern Front and demonstrated that the Wehrmacht could still achieve tactical victories even in desperate circumstances. However, the larger strategic situation continued to deteriorate. Manstein's final major offensive operation came in July 1943 at the Battle of Kursk, where German forces attempted to pinch off a Soviet salient in a massive pincer movement. The battle became the largest tank engagement in history, involving thousands of armoured vehicles on both sides. Despite Manstein's tactical skill, the offensive failed against deeply prepared Soviet defences and was called off after just 2 weeks. From that point forward, German forces on the Eastern Front would remain almost permanently on the defensive, retreating westward under relentless Soviet pressure. By early 1944, Manstein found himself in an increasingly impossible position, tasked with defending vast stretches of Soviet territory with inadequate forces, while Hitler refused to authorize tactical withdrawals that might have saved German armies from encirclement. When Manstein repeatedly urged Hitler to adopt a more flexible defensive strategy, their relationship became strained. On March 30, 1944, Hitler dismissed Manstein from command, ostensibly for health reasons, but actually because the Führer had grown tired of his strategic recommendations. Manstein spent the final year of the war in enforced retirement, playing no role in the final catastrophe that befell Nazi Germany. British forces captured Manstein in August 1945 and held him in custody, while prosecutors prepared cases against senior German military leaders. Unlike some of his counterparts, Manstein stood trial for his role in war crimes on the Eastern Front. From August 1949 to December 1949, a British military court in Hamburg tried Manstein on 17 charges, including responsibility for atrocities committed by forces under his command, cooperation with the Einsatzgruppen, and violations of the laws of war regarding treatment of prisoners and civilians. The trial sparked considerable controversy in Britain and Germany. Manstein's defence team, funded partly by contributions from prominent British military figures who admired his operational abilities, argued that he had acted as a professional soldier and had no direct knowledge of or involvement in atrocities. They portrayed the charges as an attempt to criminalise legitimate military operations. However, the prosecution presented substantial evidence of Manstein's knowledge of and complicity in war crimes, including orders he had issued regarding harsh treatment of partisans and cooperation with security forces. On December 19, 1949, the court found Manstein guilty on 9 of the 17 charges and sentenced him to 18 years imprisonment. The verdict reflected the court's finding that while Manstein had not directly ordered the worst atrocities, he bore command responsibility for crimes committed by forces under his authority and had turned a blind eye to obvious violations of the laws of war. The sentence was later reduced to 12 years on appeal. Manstein served his sentence in Werl prison in West Germany, where he used his time to begin work on his memoirs. Growing pressure from German political figures and some British military veterans led to further reductions in his sentence. In May 1953, citing health concerns, British authorities released Manstein after he had served just over 4 years of his original sentence. He was 65 years old and suffering from various ailments. After his release, Manstein became an influential figure in West Germany's nascent military establishment. The newly formed Bundeswehr, West Germany's modern armed forces, sought advice from experienced Wehrmacht officers, and Manstein served as an unofficial advisor on organizational matters and tactical doctrine. He also became a prominent advocate for the clean Wehrmacht myth, using his prestige and tactical reputation to argue that the German military had fought honorably and remained separate from Nazi political crimes. In 1955, he published his widely read memoirs, Valorin Siege, Lost Victories, which presented his version of the war and defended the German military's conduct. The book became influential among Western military professionals during the Cold War era, as NATO forces studied Wehrmacht tactics for insights into how to defend Western Europe against a potential Soviet invasion. This rehabilitation of Wehrmacht commanders served Cold War political purposes, but often came at the cost of historical truth about their complicity in Nazi crimes. Manstein lived for 2 more decades in comfortable retirement, receiving a state pension and enjoying respect from much of the German public and international military community. He never expressed meaningful remorse for the crimes committed under his command or acknowledged the moral catastrophe of the regime he had served. Erich von Manstein died on June 9, 1973, at the age of 85, having successfully rehabilitated his reputation in the eyes of many while avoiding full accountability for his role in the Third Reich's atrocities. Alfred Jodel stood at the very centre of Nazi Germany's war machine throughout World War II, serving as the chief of the operations staff of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command of the Armed Forces. Born on May 10, 1890, in Würzburg, Bavaria, Jodel came from a military family and joined the Bavarian Army in 1910. He distinguished himself during World War I as an artillery officer and staff officer, demonstrating the organisational capabilities that would define his later career. In the interwar years, Jodel remained in the Reichswehr and became an early supporter of Hitler's regime, seeing in National Socialism a path to restore German military power. After the humiliation of Versailles, by 1939, Jodel had risen to become one of the most influential figures in German military planning, working directly with Hitler on strategic decisions. His position gave him intimate knowledge of every major military operation undertaken by Nazi Germany and made him complicit in the regime's crimes from the very beginning. Jodel attended the infamous speech on March 30, 1941, when Hitler outlined to senior officers his vision for the war against the Soviet Union as an ideological conflict of annihilation rather than a conventional military campaign. Rather than objecting to Hitler's criminal intentions, Jodl embraced them and worked to translate the Führer's political objectives into operational military orders. Throughout the war, Jodl remained at Hitler's side, present at the various field headquarters from which the dictator directed Germany's military operations. He was among the small circle of officers who had regular access to Hitler and who bore direct responsibility for implementing his decisions. Jodl's role went far beyond mere staff work. He actively participated in strategic planning, advocated for specific military operations, and translated Hitler's often vague or contradictory instructions into concrete orders for commanders in the field. His influence extended across all theatres of war, from the Atlantic to the steppes of Russia. Among Jodl's most notorious actions was his endorsement and distribution of the Commando Order of October 1942, which mandated the immediate execution of Allied Special Forces soldiers captured behind German lines, even if they were in uniform and attempting to surrender. This order represented a flagrant violation of the Geneva Conventions and resulted in the murder of numerous Allied prisoners of war. Similarly, Jodl supported the Commissar Order of June 1941, which called for the summary execution of Soviet political officers captured on the Eastern Front. These orders revealed Jodl's complete moral bankruptcy and his willingness to criminalize warfare in service of Nazi ideology. On July 20th, 1944, Jodl narrowly escaped death when Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg's bomb exploded during a conference at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. The assassination attempt, part of a conspiracy to kill Hitler and negotiate peace with the Western Allies, failed when Hitler survived with relatively minor injuries. Jodl suffered some wounds from the blast, but quickly recovered and participated in the savage reprisals against the conspirators and their families. His survival ensured that he remained at Hitler's side through the final catastrophic months of the war. In the apocalyptic final days of the Third Reich, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin and Hitler prepared for his final act, Jodl evacuated to the new headquarters at Flensburg in northern Germany. After Hitler's suicide on April 30th, 1945, Jodl served in the short-lived Flensburg government under Admiral Donitz. On May 7, 1945, at Reims, France, Jodl signed the unconditional surrender documents on behalf of the German High Command, formally ending the war in Europe. This final official act of the Third Reich brought Jodl's career full circle, from his enthusiastic support for the regime's rise to signing its death warrant. British forces arrested Jodl on May 23, 1945, along with the rest of Donitz's government, and transported him first to Camp Ashcan in Luxembourg, where American interrogators began the process of documenting his role in Nazi crimes. From there, he was transferred to Nuremberg to face trial before the International Military Tribunal. At Nuremberg, Jodl stood in the dock alongside the surviving leaders of Nazi Germany, charged with conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and waging aggressive war, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The prosecution presented a devastating case against him, documenting his central role in planning and executing Germany's wars of aggression and his direct responsibility for numerous war crimes. Specific evidence focused on his endorsement of the Commando Order and the Commissar Order, his participation in planning the invasions of neutral countries, and his knowledge of and complicity in atrocities against civilians and prisoners of war. Perhaps most damning were documents bearing his signature ordering the deportation of Danish citizens, including Jews, to concentration camps and approving brutal anti-partisan operations that deliberately targeted civilian populations. During the trial, Jodl attempted to defend his actions by claiming he was merely following orders and fulfilling his duty as a German officer. He argued that he had opposed some of Hitler's decisions, but had ultimately subordinated his judgment to the Führer's authority, as military protocol demanded. This defense of superior orders had been explicitly rejected by the tribunal's charter, which held that following illegal orders did not absolve individuals of criminal responsibility. Jodl also tried to refute specific charges, successfully demonstrating that he had not been involved in Hitler's rise to power in 1933, as one accusation alleged. However, these minor victories could not overcome the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. Jodl pleaded not guilty to all charges, maintaining throughout the trial that he had acted as a loyal German soldier rather than a war criminal. The tribunal was unpersuaded by this argument. On October 1st, 1946, the court found Jodel guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced him to death by hanging. The verdict reflected the judge's conclusion that Jodel's position at the heart of the Nazi war machine made him one of the principal architects of German aggression, and that his direct involvement in issuing criminal orders left no room for leniency. On October 16th, 1946, in the early morning hours, Alfred Jodel was led to the gallows in Nuremberg prison. His final words were reported as "Ich grüße dich, mein ewiges Deutschland," meaning, "I salute you, my eternal Germany." This farewell revealed that Jodel remained unrepentant to the end, viewing himself as a German patriot rather than a war criminal. He was 56 years old when he died. After his execution, Jodel's body was cremated and his ashes scattered in a river, denying him a burial site that might become a shrine for Nazi sympathizers. In a bizarre postscript to Jodel's story, a West German denazification court in 1953 posthumously overturned his conviction, declaring him not guilty of the charges for which he had been hanged at Nuremberg. This decision reflected the political climate of Cold War West Germany, where former Wehrmacht officers had regained considerable influence and worked to rehabilitate the military's reputation. However, the German government reversed this decision in 1954 under pressure from Allied authorities, reaffirming Jodel's status as a convicted war criminal. His case thus became entangled in the complex politics of memory and justice in post-war Germany, where questions of guilt and accountability remained deeply contested. Wilhelm Keitel represented perhaps the most tragic example of a German officer who sacrificed his professional integrity and moral compass in service to Adolf Hitler. Born on September 22, 1882 in Helmscherode, Lower Saxony, Keitel came from a middle-class family with some military connections but lacked the aristocratic pedigree of many of his contemporaries. He joined the army in 1901 and served primarily in artillery units during World War I, where he earned a solid, if unspectacular, record. During the interwar years of the Weimar Republic, Keitel advanced through a combination of competence in administrative matters and political adaptability. He gained promotion to Major General in 1933, coinciding with Hitler's rise to power, and took command of an infantry division in 1934. It was during this period that Keitel developed a strong personal admiration for Hitler that would prove catastrophic for his judgment and, ultimately, his legacy. From 1935 to 1938, as Hitler consolidated power and began purging the military of officers he considered unreliable, Keitel worked on developing plans for a unified command structure that would bring the armed forces more directly under the Führer's control. In February 1938, following the Blomberg-Fritsch affair, a manufactured scandal that allowed Hitler to remove the top leadership of the Wehrmacht, the dictator appointed Keitel as chief of the newly created Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, effectively making him the head of Hitler's personal military staff. This appointment proved to be a turning point in German military history, as Keitel's subservience to Hitler allowed the dictator to bypass traditional military chains of command and impose his will directly on operations. Keitel's colleagues in the officer corps quickly recognized his lack of backbone when it came to challenging Hitler's decisions. He earned the derisive nickname Lackeitel, a play on his name, and the German word Lakai, meaning lackey or toady, reflecting his reputation for slavish obedience to the Führer. Despite this mockery from other officers, or perhaps because of his awareness of it, Keitel clung ever more tightly to Hitler's favour, seeing his position as dependent entirely on maintaining the dictator's confidence. This dynamic would lead him to endorse and facilitate some of the war's worst atrocities. As chief of the OKW, Keitel participated in planning virtually every major German military operation of World War II. He played a significant role in the annexation of Austria in March 1938 and the occupation of Czechoslovakia later that year, helping to coordinate the military and political aspects of these aggressive acts. In 1939, he was involved in planning the invasion of Poland that triggered World War II, working to ensure military operations aligned with Hitler's political objectives. In June 1940, following the fall of France, Keitel had the dubious honour of presenting the surrender terms to the French government in the same railway carriage at Compiègne, where Germany had signed the armistice ending World War I. This carefully staged humiliation of France delighted Hitler, and he rewarded Keitel with promotion to Field Marshal on July 19, 1940. For Keitel, this represented the apex of his career, the culmination of decades of military service and absolute loyalty to the Nazi regime. However, the price of this success was his complete moral compromise, as he had already begun to involve himself in activities that would later be classified as war crimes. From 1940 onward, Keitel's signature appeared on numerous orders that violated international law and basic human decency. He transmitted Hitler's directives regarding the brutal occupation policies in the East, including orders for collective reprisals against civilian populations and the summary execution of political commissars and partisans. In September 1941, Keitel signed the Night and Fog Decree, which mandated that resistance fighters in occupied territories should simply disappear into night and fog, transported to concentration camps or executed without trial, with their families left in agonizing uncertainty about their fate. This decree represented a deliberate policy of terror designed to crush resistance through fear and uncertainty. In 1942, Keitel endorsed the commando order requiring the execution of Allied Special Forces soldiers, and he repeatedly transmitted orders calling for the harshest possible measures against partisans and civilians suspected of supporting resistance movements. On July 20, 1944, Keitel was present at the Wolf's Lair when Stauffenberg's bomb exploded in an attempt to assassinate Hitler. He escaped with minor injuries and immediately threw himself into the investigation and punishment of the conspirators. Keitel served on the so-called Court of Honor that expelled many suspected conspirators from the military, stripping them of their ranks and legal protections so they could be tried in civilian courts dominated by Nazi loyalists. This kangaroo court process ensured that the conspirators would be convicted and executed, often after brutal torture. Keitel personally participated in the witch hunt that followed the failed assassination, demonstrating his willingness to destroy fellow officers to maintain his position with Hitler. In the final months of the war, as Germany's defeat became inevitable, Keitel remained at Hitler's side, issuing increasingly desperate orders to non-existent armies and endorsing scorched earth policies designed to leave nothing for the advancing Allies. He was present in Hitler's bunker during the final days of the Third Reich and was among the last to see the dictator alive. After Hitler's suicide, Keitel served briefly in the Flensburg government under Donitz before British forces arrested him on May 13, 1945. At his capture, Keitel still wore his field marshal's uniform and attempted to maintain military bearing, though he must have known the reckoning that awaited him. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg indicted Keitel in August 1945 on 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. During the trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of Keitel's role in planning aggressive wars and implementing criminal policies. His signature appeared on dozens of orders authorizing atrocities, from the Night and Fog Decree to directives mandating brutal anti-partisan operations that deliberately targeted civilians. The prosecution portrayed Keitel as one of the principal enablers of Nazi criminality, arguing that his military authority had been used to legitimize and implement Hitler's worst impulses. What distinguished Keitel from many other defendants at Nuremberg was his willingness to accept responsibility for his actions, though this acceptance came without genuine understanding or remorse. He acknowledged that he had signed the orders presented in evidence and admitted that he bore responsibility for their consequences. During his testimony, Keitel famously stated, "I believed, and I believe today, that under the circumstances I had no option but to act as I did." This attempt to explain his actions through reference to his duty to obey Hitler failed to impress the tribunal, which rejected the defense of superior orders. The court also heard evidence of Keitel's personal complicity in specific atrocities, including his role in transmitting orders for the murder of Soviet prisoners of war and his endorsement of policies that led to mass starvation in prisoner of war camps. Witnesses testified to his presence at meetings where criminal policies were discussed and his active participation in developing the administrative mechanisms for implementing these policies. Unlike some defendants who claimed ignorance or attempted to minimize their roles, Keitel could not credibly deny his centrality to the Nazi war machine. On October 1, 1946, the tribunal found Keitel guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced him to death by hanging. The verdict noted that Keitel had used his military position and reputation to facilitate crimes on a massive scale, and that his loyalty to Hitler had led him to abandon any moral constraints on his actions. The court rejected his claim that following orders absolved him of responsibility, establishing the principle that individuals have a duty to disobey manifestly criminal orders. On October 16, 1946, Wilhelm Keitel was led to the gallows in Nuremberg prison. According to witnesses, he maintained his military bearing to the end, walking calmly to his execution. His final request was to be shot as a soldier rather than hanged as a criminal. But this was denied. As he mounted the scaffold, Keitel's last words were reported as, "I call on God Almighty to have mercy on the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers went to their death for the fatherland before me. I follow now my sons, all for Germany." These final words reflected Keitel's tragic self-delusion, his inability to recognize that his actions had brought catastrophe to the very Germany he claimed to serve. He died at age 64, one of the most thoroughly discredited figures in German military history, remembered not for any tactical brilliance or strategic insight, but for his servile obedience to a criminal regime. Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb exemplified the complexities and contradictions of the German officer corps' relationship with National Socialism. Born on September 5, 1876 in Passau, Bavaria, Leeb came from a military family and joined the Bavarian army in 1895. He distinguished himself as a capable officer during World War I, demonstrating both tactical skill and personal courage that earned him several decorations, including the prestigious Military Order of Max Joseph. This honour carried with it a hereditary noble title, transforming Wilhelm Leeb into Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb and elevating his social status within the rigidly hierarchical Prussian military establishment. During the turbulent years of the Weimar Republic, Leeb remained in the drastically reduced Reichswehr, where his professional competence and conservative political views ensured steady advancement. By the early 1930s, he had reached senior rank and was regarded as one of the army's leading experts on defensive warfare. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Leeb initially maintained some distance from the Nazi regime, viewing National Socialism with the skepticism typical of conservative Bavarian Catholics. However, his professional ambitions and the opportunities presented by German rearmament gradually eroded whatever scruples he might have had about serving the new government. In 1938, Leeb published a military manual on defensive tactics that would later be widely studied and became a standard text on the subject. By the outbreak of war in 1939, Leeb commanded Army Group C during the invasion of Poland, though his forces saw relatively limited action compared to those in the main thrusts. His real opportunity came in 1940 during the invasion of France, when Army Group C played a crucial supporting role in the campaign. The swift German victory earned Leeb promotion to Field Marshal on July 19, 1940, placing him among the elite of the Wehrmacht. However, the accomplishments that brought Leeb this honour would soon be overshadowed by his participation in crimes of historic proportions. On March 30, 1941, Leeb was among more than 200 senior officers who attended a speech by Adolf Hitler at the Reich Chancellery. In this address, later described by historians as one of the most significant moments in the development of Nazi criminality, Hitler outlined his vision for the coming war against the Soviet Union. He explicitly described the campaign not as a conventional military operation, but as an ideological war of annihilation against Jewish Bolshevism. Hitler made clear that the normal rules of warfare would not apply, that political commissars were to be executed immediately, and that the local population would be subjected to brutal policies designed to destroy Soviet society and make way for German colonization. Leeb heard all of this and raised no objection, a silence that would later condemn him as complicit in what followed. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, Leeb commanded Army Group North, tasked with advancing through the Baltic states and capturing Leningrad. His forces moved rapidly in the opening weeks of the campaign, benefiting from the element of surprise and the disorganization of Soviet defenses. However, as Leeb's army group approached Leningrad in the fall of 1941, Hitler made the fateful decision to besiege the Oas city rather than attempt a direct assault. This decision condemned Leningrad's civilian population to a horrific ordeal of starvation and bombardment that would eventually kill more than 1 million people. While Leeb later claimed to have opposed the siege strategy on military grounds, preferring a direct assault that might have captured the city quickly, he implemented Hitler's orders without public protest. More damningly, forces under Leeb's command cooperated extensively with SS Einsatzgruppen operating in his rear areas. These mobile killing units, tasked with murdering Jews, communist officials, and other perceived enemies of the Reich relied on the army for logistical support, intelligence about local populations, and sometimes direct assistance in rounding up victims. Documentary evidence later revealed that Leeb was regularly briefed on these operations and made army resources available to support them. In Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, as German forces advanced, tens of thousands of Jews and other civilians were systematically murdered, often with the knowledge and cooperation of army units answering to Leeb. One of the most infamous orders associated with Leeb's command was the Barbarossa Decree, also known as the Commissar Order, which he transmitted to subordinate units. This directive mandated the immediate execution of Soviet political commissars captured in battle, explicitly violating the Geneva Conventions regarding treatment of prisoners of war. Leeb's signature appeared on documents distributing this criminal order throughout Army Group North, making him directly responsible for its implementation and the murders that resulted. By January 1942, the brutal Russian winter and fierce Soviet resistance had stalled German advances and inflicted heavy casualties. Leeb found himself in an increasingly impossible tactical situation, with his forces overextended and undersupplied. On January 15, 1942, he requested that Hitler either grant him full operational autonomy or relieve him of command, knowing that the Führer would never agree to delegate authority. Hitler chose to remove him, and Leeb was replaced by General Georg von Kuchler. Unlike some commanders who were recalled to service multiple times, Leeb never received another command, spending the remainder of the war in retirement at his Bavarian estate. British forces arrested Leeb in May 1945 and held him for trial at Nuremberg. However, he was not included in the main International Military Tribunal, but instead faced charges at the High Command Trial, one of the subsequent proceedings that prosecuted Wehrmacht leaders specifically for their roles in military crimes. The trial, which began in December 1947, presented evidence of Leeb's transmission of the Barbarossa Decree, his cooperation with Einsatzgruppen operations, and his command responsibility for atrocities committed by forces under his authority in the Soviet Union. Leeb's defense strategy involved portraying himself as a professional soldier who had merely followed established military procedures and arguing that he had not personally witnessed or ordered specific atrocities. His attorneys emphasized his retirement from active command in early 1942, suggesting that this demonstrated his disapproval of Nazi policies. They also argued that the harsh conditions of warfare on the Eastern Front made some brutal measures necessary and that Leeb had attempted to maintain military discipline and honor within the constraints imposed by higher authority. The tribunal convicted Leeb of transmitting criminal orders and bearing command responsibility for their implementation by subordinate units. However, in a verdict that many considered surprisingly lenient, he received only a 3-year prison sentence, which was effectively time served since he had been in custody since 1945. The court's judgment stated that while criminal orders had been transmitted through his command, no order bearing his personal signature or explicit approval of specific atrocities had been introduced into evidence. This narrow interpretation of command responsibility allowed Leeb to escape severe punishment, despite substantial evidence of his knowledge and facilitation of war crimes. The lenient sentence reflected several factors, including Leeb's relatively brief tenure in command on the Eastern Front, his retirement before the worst phases of partisan warfare and anti-Jewish operations, and possibly some sympathy from the tribunal for his age, and claimed ignorance of the full scope of SS activities in his rear areas. However, the verdict also revealed limitations in how post-war justice addressed the complicity of senior military commanders who enabled crimes through passive cooperation rather than active direction. After his release in 1948, Leeb returned to his estate at Hohenschwangau in Bavaria, where he lived quietly in retirement. Unlike some former Wehrmacht officers who became involved in veterans organizations or wrote apologetic memoirs, Leeb maintained a relatively low profile in his final years. It later emerged that he had received substantial financial benefits from the Nazi regime during the war, including secret gifts totaling 250,000 Reichsmarks and an estate valued at 660,000 Reichsmarks. These payments revealed that despite his later attempts to portray himself as a professional soldier who served Germany rather than Nazism, he had been materially rewarded for his loyalty to the regime. Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb died on April 29, 1956, following a heart attack. He was 79 years old. His case remains emblematic of the challenges inherent in achieving justice for military crimes, where command responsibility can be difficult to prove definitively and where distinguished military careers can obscure complicity in atrocities. The relatively light punishment he received contributed to perceptions that some high-ranking Wehrmacht officers escaped meaningful accountability for their roles in Nazi crimes, undermining efforts at comprehensive denazification and historical reckoning. Maximilian von Weichs represented another face of the Wehrmacht's complicity in Nazi crimes, a career officer whose military service took him from the battlefields of France to the brutal anti-partisan campaigns of the Balkans. Born on November 12, 1881, in Dessau, von Weichs came from an aristocratic family with strong military traditions. He joined the Bavarian army in 1900 and served with distinction during World War I, where he gained experience in both staff work and field command that would serve him throughout his subsequent career. During the interwar years, Weichs navigated the political complexities of the Weimar Republic and the early Nazi period, advancing steadily without making himself particularly conspicuous, either as a Nazi enthusiast or as a regime opponent. By the outbreak of World War II, he had risen to command the Second Army, positioning him to play significant roles in Germany's major campaigns. Weichs commanded forces during the invasions of France in 1940, Yugoslavia in 1941, and the Soviet Union beginning in June 1941. His Second Army participated in the opening phases of Operation Barbarossa, advancing through Ukraine as part of Army Group South. During these campaigns, Weichs demonstrated competent, if not brilliant, leadership, managing complex logistics and coordinating operations across vast distances. However, like virtually all senior commanders on the Eastern Front, his forces were implicated in war crimes against civilians and prisoners of war, implementing the harsh occupation policies mandated by Hitler and the OKW. The scale of atrocities associated with German operations in Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union was staggering, and commanders like Weichs bore responsibility for creating the conditions that enabled systematic brutality. In 1944, Hitler appointed Weichs commander of German forces in the Balkans, a position that would define the final phase of his military career and seal his fate in the post-war reckoning. The Balkans had become a nightmarish theatre for German occupation forces, with multiple partisan groups, ethnic conflicts, and competing Allied interests creating a chaotic and violent situation. Weichs was tasked with maintaining German control over strategically vital territory, while suppressing increasingly effective resistance movements in Yugoslavia and Greece. The methods employed under his command were brutal in the extreme, characterized by massive reprisals against civilian populations for partisan attacks, systematic destruction of villages suspected of supporting resistance fighters, and the murder of thousands of hostages. The doctrine of collective responsibility was applied ruthlessly. For every German soldier killed by partisans, dozens or even hundreds of civilians would be executed in retaliation. These policies were not the result of isolated incidents or rogue units acting without authorization. They reflected official German policy in the region, policy that Weichs was responsible for implementing and overseeing. Documentary evidence would later reveal that Weichs was regularly informed about anti-partisan operations and the scale of civilian casualties. He transmitted orders from Berlin regarding harsh reprisals and approved operational plans that inevitably resulted in atrocities. The distinction between legitimate military operations against armed partisans and the murder of innocent civilians became increasingly blurred, with German forces often making little effort to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Entire villages were destroyed, their populations massacred or deported in operations conducted by forces under Weichs's command. In Greece, German forces implemented similarly brutal policies, conducting massacres such as the one at Distomo in June 1944, where more than 200 civilians were murdered in retaliation for partisan activity. While it cannot be proven that Weichs directly ordered specific massacres, his position as theatre commander made him responsible for the overall conduct of forces under his authority and for the policies that made such atrocities routine rather than exceptional. On March 25, 1945, as the military situation in the Balkans became untenable and Allied forces advanced from multiple directions, Weichs retired from active command. This retirement likely saved his life, as it meant he was not in a command position when Germany surrendered, potentially allowing him to claim he bore less responsibility for the final desperate phase of the war. American forces arrested him in May 1945 and held him for trial alongside other Wehrmacht commanders accused of war crimes in the Balkans. The hostages trial, officially known as United States of America versus Wilhelm List et al., was one of the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings focusing specifically on crimes committed in southeastern Europe. Weichs was scheduled to stand trial alongside Wilhelm List, Lothar Rendulic, and other commanders who had served in the region. The charges against him related to his command responsibility for the brutal suppression of partisans and the systematic murder of civilians in reprisal operations. Evidence collected by prosecutors documented hundreds of specific incidents where forces under his authority had committed atrocities, creating what appeared to be an overwhelming case for conviction. However, in a development that shocked many observers and troubled advocates of comprehensive justice, Weichs was removed from the trial proceedings before they began. The official explanation given by American military authorities was medical reasons, a vague justification that raised immediate questions about whether health concerns were genuine or politically convenient. Weichs was reported to be suffering from various ailments related to his age and years of military service, but whether these conditions truly made him unfit to stand trial or whether other factors influenced the decision remains a subject of historical debate. The practical effect of this decision was that Weichs escaped prosecution entirely despite substantial evidence of his involvement in war crimes. This outcome exemplified one of the persistent frustrations of post-war justice. Political considerations, practical constraints, and sometimes simple chance allowed some perpetrators to evade accountability, while others faced severe punishment for comparable crimes. The arbitrary nature of these outcomes undermined the principle that justice should be blind, and that all participants in criminal enterprises should face equal accountability. After being excluded from the hostages trial, Weichs was eventually released from custody without ever facing formal charges. He spent his remaining years in Bonn, West Germany, living in relative obscurity compared to more prominent former Wehrmacht officers. Unlike commanders such as Manstein or Kesselring, who became public figures in post-war Germany and contributed to veterans' organizations, Weichs maintained a low profile, perhaps recognizing the controversy that would surround any attempt to rehabilitate his reputation. Maximilian von Weichs died on September 27, 1954, in Bonn at the age of 72, having never answered in court for the crimes committed by forces under his command in the Balkans. His case stands as a reminder that while the Nuremberg trials represented a historic step toward international justice and accountability for war crimes, they remained imperfect instruments that failed to reach all those who bore responsibility for Nazi atrocities. The gap between the ideal of comprehensive justice and the reality of selective prosecution left many questions unresolved and allowed some perpetrators to escape the consequences they deserved. Georg von Kuchler followed a path similar to many career officers of his generation, serving Germany through 3 distinct political systems and ultimately facing accountability for crimes committed in the service of the most criminal of those regimes. Born on May 30th, 1881 in Philippsruhe, Hanau, Kuchler joined the German army in 1900 and quickly established himself as a capable officer with particular expertise in artillery tactics. During World War I, he served with distinction in various staff and command positions, demonstrating the technical competence and organizational skills that would mark his entire career. The interwar years saw Kuchler navigate the reduced circumstances of the Reichswehr with political acumen, continuing to specialize in artillery while advancing through peacetime assignments. When Hitler began the massive expansion of German military forces in the mid-1930s, Kuchler's expertise became increasingly valuable, and he rose rapidly through the ranks of the growing Wehrmacht. By the outbreak of World War II in 1939, he commanded the 18th Army, positioning him for significant roles in the coming campaigns. Kuchler's forces participated in the invasion of Poland and subsequently in the attack on France and the Low Countries in 1940, where his army played an important supporting role in the German victory. Following these successes, Kuchler was given command of Army Group North for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union that began on June 22, 1941. This appointment would prove to be the defining assignment of his career and the source of his ultimate downfall. Army Group North, under Kuchler's leadership, advanced through the Baltic states toward Leningrad, achieving substantial early successes before the campaign bogged down into a brutal siege that would last for more than 2 years. The siege of Leningrad, which began in September 1941 and continued until January 1944, resulted in one of history's worst humanitarian catastrophes, with estimates of civilian deaths ranging from 800,000 to 1.5 million people, most dying from starvation and cold during the harsh Russian winters. While military historians debate the tactical decisions that led to the siege rather than a direct assault on the city, there is no question about Kuchler's responsibility for the conduct of forces under his command during this period. He was promoted to Field Marshal in June 1942, a recognition of his competence in managing complex military operations, but also a mark of his complicity in the criminal policies being implemented in occupied Soviet territory. During Kuchler's command of Army Group North, forces under his authority committed widespread atrocities against Soviet civilians and prisoners of war. The German occupation of the Baltic states and northwestern Russia was characterized by mass executions, forced labor, systematic starvation, and cooperation with SS Einsatzgruppen in murdering Jews and other perceived enemies. Kuchler, like other commanders on ORR, the Eastern Front, received regular reports about these activities and approved harsh anti-partisan policies that deliberately blurred the lines between combating armed resistance and terrorizing civilian populations. One particularly damning aspect of Kuchler's command was the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war and the murder of mentally disabled individuals in occupied territories. German occupation authorities implemented a program to identify and murder patients in mental institutions, arguing that they consumed resources needed for the war effort and represented lives unworthy of life, according to Nazi racial ideology. Forces under Kuchler's command cooperated with these programs, providing logistical support and sometimes direct participation in killings. The scale of suffering inflicted under his authority was enormous, encompassing not just military operations but a systematic campaign of destruction against Soviet society. By early 1944, the strategic situation on the Eastern Front had turned decisively against Germany. Soviet forces had broken the siege of Leningrad and were pushing Army Group North back through the Baltic states. Kuchler found himself in the familiar position of senior German commanders during this period, caught between military reality, which demanded strategic withdrawals to avoid encirclement, and Hitler's rigid insistence on holding every inch of territory, regardless of cost. When Kuchler urged flexibility in defensive operations to preserve his forces, Hitler responded by relieving him of command on January 29, 1944. This dismissal effectively ended Kuchler's active military career. He spent the final 15 months of the war in retirement, removed from the catastrophic final collapse of German forces in the East. This early retirement may have saved his life, as it meant he was not in a command position during the final desperate months when even more extreme measures were ordered and when some commanders faced summary execution for retreating without authorization. American forces arrested Kuchler at the war's end and held him for trial as part of the High Command case, one of the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings that focused specifically on Wehrmacht leaders. The trial, which began in December 1947, brought together senior commanders from various theatres to face charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed during their tenures. For Kuchler, the charges focused primarily on his command of Army Group North and the atrocities committed by forces under his authority in the Soviet Union. Prosecutors presented extensive evidence of crimes committed during the siege of Leningrad and the occupation of the Baltic states, including documentation of Kuchler's knowledge of and complicity in these activities. Specific charges related to the murder of mentally disabled individuals, the systematic starvation of civilian populations, cooperation with Einsatzgruppen operations, and the brutal treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. The prosecution argued that Kuchler's position as Army Group Commander made him directly responsible for these crimes and that his claims of ignorance were contradicted by the regular intelligence reports and operational briefings he received. During the trial, Kuchler attempted to defend his actions by attributing many of the horrific conditions in prisoner of war camps and occupied territories to factors beyond his control. He claimed that the harsh Russian winter conditions, which he described somewhat bizarrely as an act of God, were primarily responsible for prisoner mortality rather than deliberate German policies. He also suggested that the army had exaggerated prisoner of war death rates in reports to higher command in order to receive additional supplies, implying that the actual suffering was less severe than documented. These arguments failed to convince the tribunal, which found abundant evidence that criminal policies, not mere environmental factors, had caused mass death. The court heard testimony about deliberate starvation policies, inadequate shelter provided to prisoners in brutal winter conditions, systematic executions, and the denial of medical care. Documents bearing Kuchler's signature show that he had been informed about conditions in POW camps and had approved measures that worsened rather than alleviated suffering. On October 28, 1948, the tribunal found Kuchler guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced him to 20 years imprisonment. The sentence reflected the court's finding that while Kuchler had not personally ordered the most extreme atrocities, he bore command responsibility for creating and maintaining conditions that enabled systematic criminality. He had transmitted criminal orders from higher command, failed to prevent atrocities committed by forces under his authority, and actively participated in occupation policies designed to destroy Soviet society. However, in a pattern that became common with Wehrmacht commanders, Kuchler's sentence was subsequently reduced. In 1951, American military authorities reviewing the high command trial sentences reduced his term to 12 years, citing various legal and procedural considerations. This reduction reflected the changing political climate of the early Cold War, when West Germany was being integrated into the Western Alliance and pressure mounted to show leniency toward former Wehrmacht officers. In February 1953, after serving less than 5 years of his original sentence, Kuchler was released from prison due to health concerns. He was 71 years old and suffering from various ailments related to his age. He relocated to the Garmisch region of Bavaria, where he lived with his wife in quiet retirement, largely avoiding public attention and controversy. Unlike some former Wehrmacht commanders who became active in veterans organizations or wrote memoirs defending their actions, Kuchler maintained a relatively low profile during his final years. Georg von Kuchler died on May 25, 1968, in Garmisch-Partenkirchen at the age of 87, having lived for 15 years after his release from prison. His case exemplified the pattern whereby senior Wehrmacht commanders initially received substantial sentences for war crimes, but ultimately served only a fraction of their terms before being released on health grounds or through sentence reductions. This pattern of leniency troubled many who believed that justice required full accountability and undermined arguments that the Nuremberg trials had comprehensively addressed Nazi criminality. Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist came from one of Prussia's most distinguished military families, with ancestors who had served as soldiers and commanders for generations. Born on August 8, 1881, in Braunfels, Kleist seemed destined from birth for a military career that would honour his family's traditions. He joined the army in 1900 and served with distinction during World War I, gaining experience in cavalry operations and staff work. During the interwar years, Kleist remained in the Reichswehr and successfully made the transition from traditional cavalry to mechanized warfare, recognizing that armored vehicles would dominate future battlefields. This adaptability served him well when Hitler began the massive expansion and modernization of German forces in the mid-1930s. By 1939, Kleist had reached senior rank and was positioned to play a crucial role in the coming war. During the invasion of France in May 1940, Kleist commanded the 1st Panzer Group, leading the armoured thrust through the Ardennes that would become one of the most celebrated operations in military history. His tank formations, exploiting the element of surprise and the Allies' mistaken belief that the Ardennes was impassable to armour, penetrated deep into French defences and raced toward the English Channel. The speed and violence of this advance split the Allied armies and contributed decisively to France's rapid defeat. This success established Kleist's reputation as one of Germany's premier armoured commanders and earned him promotion to full general. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, Kleist commanded the 1st Panzer Army as part of Army Group South, tasked with advancing into Ukraine and capturing the vital industrial and agricultural resources of the Soviet Union's breadbasket. The opening months of the campaign saw spectacular German successes, with Kleist's forces participating in massive encirclement operations that trapped hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. The battles of Uman and Kiev, in which Kleist's armour played crucial roles, resulted in some of the largest prisoner hauls in military history and seemed to vindicate Hitler's confidence in a quick victory over the Soviet Union. However, these tactical victories masked deeper strategic problems: the vast distances involved in the Eastern Campaign, the primitive road network, and the resilience of Soviet resistance combined to create logistical nightmares that would ultimately doom German operations. By the winter of 1941, as temperatures plummeted and Soviet forces counterattacked, Kleist found himself commanding exhausted troops operating far from their supply bases in increasingly desperate circumstances. The harsh Russian winter, which German planners had catastrophically underestimated, stalled the German offensive and inflicted horrific casualties from frostbite and exposure. In 1942, as Germany launched its summer offensive aimed at capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus, Kleist received appointment as commander of Army Group A, one of the war's most prestigious and challenging commands. The Caucasus campaign reflected Hitler's strategic priorities. Germany needed oil to fuel its war machine, and the Baku oil fields represented the richest prize in the Soviet Union. Kleist's forces advanced rapidly in the summer heat covering vast distances and reaching deep into the Caucasus Mountains. However, the offensive represented a catastrophic overextension of German capabilities. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point, Soviet resistance stiffened, and the diversion of forces to the Stalingrad operation weakened Kleist's army group at crucial moments. By early 1943, following the disaster at Stalingrad and the collapse of the southern sector of the German front, Kleist was forced to retreat from the Caucasus, abandoning the oil fields that had been the objective of months of costly campaigning. The retreat from the Caucasus marked a turning point in the war and in Kleist's career. From that point forward, German forces on the Eastern Front would remain almost permanently on the defensive, conducting fighting withdrawals and attempting to slow the Soviet advance rather than achieving strategic objectives. Kleist commanded retreating forces through 1943 and early 1944, attempting to maintain some coherent defensive line in the face of overwhelming Soviet numerical superiority. On March 30, 1944, after a series of retreats and the loss of vast territories, Hitler dismissed Kleist from command and replaced him with Ferdinand Schörner, a fanatical Nazi loyalist known for his brutal discipline and unwavering commitment to holding positions regardless of cost. Kleist's dismissal reflected Hitler's growing distrust of professional military officers and his preference for commanders whose ideological commitment outweighed their tactical judgment. Following the failed assassination attempt against Hitler on July 20, 1944, the Gestapo arrested Kleist despite his lack of involvement in the conspiracy. The arrest stemmed from his family connections. A cousin had been involved in earlier resistance circles, including the Oster conspiracy that had contemplated removing Hitler from power. Under interrogation, Kleist successfully demonstrated that he had no knowledge of the July 20th plot and had remained loyal to the Nazi regime throughout his career. The Gestapo eventually released him without trial, though the arrest must have been a sobering experience that revealed the regime's paranoid suspicion of even its most loyal servants. When the war ended in May 1945, Allied forces captured Kleist and initially held him in Western custody. However, his fate took a darker turn when he was extradited to Yugoslavia to face charges related to operations in the Balkans. Yugoslav authorities sentenced him to 15 years imprisonment for war crimes committed by forces under his command during the 1941 campaign. After serving time in Yugoslav custody, Kleist was extradited again, this time to the Soviet Union, where he faced additional charges related to his extensive service on the Eastern Front. Soviet prosecutors accused him of command responsibility for atrocities committed during operations in Ukraine and the Caucasus, including cooperation with Einsatzgruppen, operations, brutal anti-partisan campaigns, and the systematic destruction of Soviet towns and villages. The Soviet trial, conducted with less procedural rigor than Western war crimes proceedings, found Kleist guilty and sentenced him to 25 years in a correctional labor camp. This sentence essentially meant life imprisonment for a man in his 60s who had already spent years in various forms of custody. Soviet labor camps, part of the vast Gulag system, were notorious for brutal conditions, inadequate food and medical care, and the use of prisoners as forced labor on industrial and construction projects in remote regions. Kleist spent his final years in Vladimir Central Prison, an infamous facility located about 180 kilometers east of Moscow that housed many high-ranking German prisoners of war and convicted war criminals. Conditions in Vladimir prison were harsh, with prisoners subjected to hard labor, minimal rations, and limited medical care. The Soviet authorities showed little interest in releasing German prisoners, particularly senior officers, seeing their continued detention as both just punishment for Nazi crimes and useful leverage in Cold War political maneuvering. On November 13, 1954, Paul Ludwig von Kleist died of heart failure while imprisoned at Vladimir Central Prison. He was 73 years old and had spent the last 9 years of his life in various forms of captivity. His death made him one of the highest-ranking German officers to die in Soviet custody, a fate that befell numerous Wehrmacht commanders who had the misfortune to be captured by Soviet forces or extradited to Soviet control. The Soviet Union did not release news of Kleist's death immediately, and his family and former comrades only learned of his fate years later. Kleist's story illustrates the different trajectories that former Wehrmacht commanders experienced in the post-war period depending on who captured them and where they had served. While commanders who surrendered to Western forces often received trials following established legal procedures, relatively moderate sentences, and early release, those who fell into Soviet hands faced harsher treatment, longer imprisonment, and frequently died in captivity before completing their sentences. Wilhelm List represented yet another variation on the theme of Wehrmacht commanders facing post-war accountability for crimes committed in service to the Nazi regime. Born on May 14, 1880 in Oberkirchberg, Württemberg, List joined the Bavarian Army in 1898 and built a solid if unspectacular career through the late imperial period and World War I. Like many officers of his generation, he remained in the Reichswehr after the Treaty of Versailles and helped to maintain professional military standards within the severely restricted German forces allowed by the peace settlement. When Hitler came to power and began the secret rearmament of Germany in violation of Versailles, List was among the experienced officers tasked with rebuilding and modernizing the Wehrmacht. His expertise in mountain warfare and his administrative capabilities made him valuable to the expanding military establishment. By 1939, List had reached senior rank and commanded forces during the invasion of Poland, where his performance earned Hitler's favor. The dictator promoted List to Field Marshal on July 19, 1940, following the successful conclusion of the French campaign, placing him among the elite of German military leadership. List's most significant independent command came in 1941, when he led Army Group A during the Balkan campaign, directing the invasions of Yugoslavia and Greece in April of that year. The campaign demonstrated German military superiority over poorly equipped and strategically isolated adversaries, with Yugoslav and Greek forces unable to withstand the combination of German air power, armoured formations, and experienced infantry. Within weeks, both countries had been occupied, though the delay caused by the Balkan operations may have contributed to the late start of Operation Barbarossa and the failure to capture Moscow before winter. However, List's involvement in the Balkans connected him directly to some of the war's worst atrocities. The region became a centre of partisan resistance and brutal German countermeasures, with policies of collective punishment and massive reprisals against civilian populations becoming standard practice. While the full extent of List's personal involvement in ordering specific massacres remains debated by historians, his position as commanding officer made him responsible for the conduct of forces under his authority. German occupation policies in the Balkans were characterized by extraordinary brutality, with entire villages destroyed and their populations murdered in retaliation for partisan attacks. The doctrine that 10 or even 100 civilians could be executed for every German soldier killed by resistance fighters was applied systematically, creating a reign of terror across the region. After the Balkan campaign, List served briefly on the Eastern Front before being given command of Army Group A for Case Blue. The German summer offensive of 1942 aimed at capturing the Caucasus oil fields. This assignment should have represented the culmination of List's career, but it instead led to his final dismissal from active service. The offensive faced enormous logistical challenges from the outset, with German forces required to advance across vast distances while maintaining supply lines that stretched far beyond their capacity. Soviet resistance proved stronger than anticipated, and the division of German forces between the Caucasus and Stalingrad operations weakened both thrusts. When the offensive faltered in the late summer of 1942, Hitler blamed List for the failure and dismissed him on September 9, 1942. Unlike some commanders who were recalled to service after cooling-off periods, List never received another command. He spent the remainder of the war in retirement, watching from the sidelines as the Third Reich spiraled toward defeat. This early retirement may have saved him from additional criminal liability, as he was not in command during the final desperate years when German forces committed some of their worst atrocities in futile attempts to stave off defeat. When the war ended in May 1945, Allied forces arrested List and held him for trial as part of the hostages trial, officially known as United States of America versus Wilhelm List et al. This proceeding, conducted by American military authorities as one of the subsequent Nuremberg trials, focused specifically on crimes committed in southeastern Europe during the German occupation. List stood accused of authorizing and implementing policies of collective punishment, ordering and permitting the execution of hostages, and bearing command responsibility for widespread atrocities against civilian populations in Yugoslavia, Greece, and Albania. The trial began in July 1947 and continued for months, with prosecutors presenting extensive evidence of crimes committed in the Balkans under List's command and the commands of other defendants. Specific incidents included the massacre of thousands of civilians in reprisal for partisan attacks, the systematic destruction of villages, and the deportation of populations for forced labor. Documentary evidence showed that List had been informed about these operations and had transmitted orders from higher command mandating harsh reprisals against civilian populations. During the trial, List's defense argued that the partisan warfare conditions in the Balkans had created an exceptional situation where normal rules of warfare could not apply. They contended that partisans' refusal to wear uniforms or follow the laws of war justified harsh German countermeasures, and that List had attempted to maintain discipline and proportionality in reprisals within the constraints imposed by higher authority. The defense also emphasized that List had been following orders from Hitler and the OKW regarding occupation policies, and that he bore no personal animosity toward the populations under German control. However, the tribunal rejected these arguments, finding that List's implementation of criminal orders made him guilty of war crimes, regardless of whether he had originated the policies himself. The court emphasized that international law imposed duties on military commanders to refuse manifestly illegal orders and to prevent crimes by forces under their authority. On February 19, 1948, the tribunal found List guilty and sentenced him to life imprisonment, one of the harshest sentences handed down in the hostages trial. The verdict reflected the court's finding that List bore substantial responsibility for atrocities in the Balkans and that his defense of superior orders was insufficient to absolve him of criminal liability. However, as with many war crimes sentences, List's imprisonment did not last nearly as long as the original verdict specified. American authorities conducting sentence reviews in the early 1950s, influenced by the changing political climate of the Cold War and pressure from West German political leaders, reduced many sentences for health and humanitarian reasons. In December 1952, after serving less than 5 years of his life sentence, List was released due to ill health. He was 72 years old and suffering from various age-related ailments that authorities deemed made continued imprisonment inhumane. List's release sparked controversy among those who believed that justice required full accountability for war crimes, and that early release for health reasons undermined the principles established at Nuremberg. However, the decision reflected the complex political realities of post-war Germany's integration into the Western Alliance and the desire to put the war behind and focus on the Cold War struggle against the Soviet Union. After his release, Wilhelm List lived quietly in retirement, largely avoiding public attention and controversy. Unlike some former Wehrmacht officers who became active in veterans' organizations or wrote memoirs defending their actions, List maintained a low profile during his remaining years. He lived for nearly 2 more decades after his release, finally dying on August 17, 1971, at the age of 91. His longevity meant that he outlived most of his contemporaries and witnessed dramatic changes in Germany and the world, from the devastation of 1945 to the economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s, from the division of Germany to détente between East and West. List's case exemplified the pattern whereby Wehrmacht commanders convicted of serious war crimes ultimately served relatively brief sentences compared to the gravity of their offences, raising enduring questions about whether post-war justice adequately addressed military criminality. Beyond the fates of individual commanders, the broader story of what happened to German soldiers after World War II encompasses millions of men who served in various capacities, from elite formations to regular Wehrmacht units. The experiences of these ordinary soldiers varied dramatically depending on where they served, who captured them, and what roles they had played during the war. For members of the Waffen SS, Hitler's elite military formations marked by their black uniforms and notorious reputation, the end of the war in May 1945 brought particular challenges. When Nazi Germany surrendered, hundreds of thousands of Waffen SS soldiers found themselves laying down their arms across a shattered European continent. Units ranging from front-line divisions like Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and Das Reich to auxiliary formations drawn from occupied territories were rounded up by American, British and Soviet troops and marched into captivity, often still wearing the uniforms that had made them symbols of terror throughout Europe. The Allied powers moved quickly to dismantle the SS in all its forms. At the Nuremberg trials held from November 1945 to October 1946, prosecutors argued that the entire SS organization, including the Waffen SS, had been a key instrument of Nazi crimes. On September 30, 1946, the International Military Tribunal formally declared the SS a criminal organization. This judgment carried profound implications, as it meant that simply belonging to the Waffen SS could constitute a crime, though the tribunal carved out exceptions for those conscripted after 1943 or proven to have avoided ideological involvement in Nazi activities. Denazification courts sprang up across occupied Germany to sort millions of former Nazis into categories ranging from major offenders to mere followers. For Waffen SS members, verdicts depended heavily on rank, theatre of service, and sometimes the politics of local authorities. A few well-known figures faced serious prosecution. SS Brigadeführer Kurt Meyer of the 12th SS Panzer Division was tried and imprisoned for atrocities in France and Belgium, while others faced military tribunals for their roles in Italy, the Balkans, or the Eastern Front. However, the vast majority of lower-ranking Waffen SS men were released within months of being detained, their records marked but their lives largely intact, allowed to return to civilian life and rebuild in the ruins of post-war Germany. Conditions in post-war detention camps were often harsh, with many prisoners kept in improvised enclosures under open sky, struggling with disease, hunger, and profound uncertainty about their futures. Allied authorities faced the overwhelming task of processing millions of detainees and focused on identifying high-ranking or particularly notorious offenders. Those not immediately slated for prosecution were gradually released during 1946 and 1947, often with no clear prospects. Some returned to ruined towns in Germany or Austria, while others drifted through displaced persons camps in Allied occupation zones, searching for missing family members or opportunities to start over. A minority of former Waffen SS officers chose flight over uncertain justice. With forged papers and assistance from sympathetic networks, some escaped Europe altogether, finding refuge in South America, the Middle East, or other regions where questions about wartime service were not asked too closely. Karl Nicolasi, a former panzer commander, reached Argentina in 1948, where he built a quiet life under Juan Perón's regime. Similar routes took other fugitives to Spain, Syria, and Egypt, their escapes later fueling stories and sometimes exaggerated claims about Nazi rat lines organized by clerical or intelligence circles to help war criminals flee justice. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video about what happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one. For those who stayed in Germany rather than fleeing, the early post-war years brought profound disillusionment and hardship. The name Waffen SS had become synonymous with brutality and fanaticism throughout occupied Europe. Their veterans found themselves excluded from employment opportunities, denied pension benefits, and even barred from official war grave commemorations. By 1948, Germany's new political authorities, operating under Allied supervision, still considered the Waffen SS a criminal entity, distinct from the regular army. In less than 3 years, a force that had once numbered nearly 1 million men was reduced to scattered individuals, each facing judgment or forced obscurity, their collective reputations sealed in the Nuremberg courtroom, but their individual fates only, beginning to unfold. The creation of the Federal Republic of Germany in May 1949 marked a new chapter not only for the nation, but also for the men who had worn German military uniforms during the war. The country's first leaders, tasked with rebuilding society under Allied supervision, inherited a population that included hundreds of thousands of former Nazi party members and soldiers. Among them were many ex-Waffen SS men, often younger, battle-scarred and politically toxic, as well as millions of former Wehrmacht soldiers attempting to reintegrate into civilian life. For Western Allied authorities, the initial stance was clear. The Waffen SS remained a criminal organization, and its veterans were to be excluded from civil service, pensions, and public employment. Regular Wehrmacht soldiers faced less severe restrictions but still encountered suspicion and social stigma. However, West Germany's rapid reconstruction soon collided with the practical realities of reintegrating millions of demobilized soldiers. As the Cold War deepened and the threat of Soviet expansion became the dominant concern of Western policy, political pragmatism began to outweigh strict denazification principles. The new state needed stability, economic growth and votes, and former soldiers represented a significant portion of the electorate. By the early 1950s, political debates over veteran welfare dominated the Bundestag, West Germany's parliament. The introduction of the Bundesversorgungsgesetz, the Federal War Victims Relief Act of 1950, became a major turning point in how post-war Germany treated its veterans. Designed ostensibly to support disabled veterans and war widows, the legislation ignited fierce controversy. Should men of the Waffen SS receive benefits like regular Wehrmacht soldiers, or should their service in a criminal organization disqualify them from state support? Conservative politicians, including Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, eventually agreed that excluding Waffen SS, veterans entirely would risk alienating a large and organized voter base that could potentially turn to extremist parties. In 1953, Adenauer publicly declared that the men of the Waffen SS had fought as soldiers just like others, a statement that carried heavy symbolic weight and signaled West Germany's quiet shift toward normalizing Waffen SS veterans as part of the broader soldier community. In practice, this meant many former SS men could now claim limited pensions, especially those who could demonstrate post-1943 conscription rather than voluntary enlistment early in the war. For regular Wehrmacht veterans, the process of reintegration proved somewhat easier, though far from simple. Millions of former soldiers returned to a Germany that bore little resemblance to the country they had left. Cities lay in ruins, the economy was shattered, and Allied occupation authorities controlled all aspects of governance. Many veterans found their homes destroyed, their families scattered or dead, and their pre-war employment prospects eliminated by the destruction of German industry. The psychological trauma of defeat compounded these material hardships. Soldiers who had believed in German military superiority and Nazi ideology faced the collapse of their worldview alongside the collapse of their country. Others who had fought reluctantly or who had grown disillusioned during the war still struggled with survivor's guilt, memories of combat trauma, and the moral weight of participating in a criminal regime's military operations. The denazification process, while primarily focused on Nazi party members and prominent officials, also affected military veterans. Allied occupation authorities required all Germans to complete questionnaires detailing their activities during the Nazi period, and tribunals sorted respondents into categories ranging from major offenders to followers. For most ordinary soldiers who had not held high rank or committed documented atrocities, denazification resulted in relatively minor penalties, or none at all. The sheer scale of the task, with millions of cases to process, led to considerable inconsistency in how tribunals handled individual soldiers. Some veterans faced travel restrictions, temporary bans from certain professions, or requirements to perform community service. Others passed through the process with minimal consequences. By the late 1940s, as Cold War tensions increased and West German cooperation became valuable to Western powers, denazification efforts were quietly scaled back. The focus shifted from punishing past behavior to rebuilding Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. For veterans captured by Soviet forces, the experience differed dramatically from those held by Western allies. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers found themselves in Soviet prisoner of war camps, often under brutal conditions that rivaled or exceeded the hardships of combat. The Soviet Union, which had suffered tens of millions of casualties during the German invasion, showed little sympathy for captured Wehrmacht personnel. Many German POWs were put to forced labor, working on reconstruction projects in mines, in factories, or on collective farms throughout the Soviet Union. Conditions in these camps were notoriously harsh, with inadequate food, minimal medical care, exposure to extreme weather, and brutal treatment from guards who had witnessed German atrocities firsthand. Mortality rates in Soviet POW camps were significantly higher than in Western camps. Estimates suggest that of the approximately 3 million German soldiers captured by Soviet forces, roughly 1 million died in captivity from starvation, disease, exposure, or execution. The survivors faced years of imprisonment, with the last German POWs not being released from Soviet custody until the mid-1950s. When they finally returned to Germany, often a decade after the war's end, they found a country transformed, families that had given them up for dead, and a society that had moved on without them. The psychological impact of this prolonged captivity and the trauma of what they had witnessed and endured in Soviet camps left lasting scars on these men. For German soldiers captured by Western allies, conditions were generally better, though far from comfortable. American, British, and French authorities established numerous POW camps across occupied Germany and in their home countries. While these camps maintained basic standards of treatment required by the Geneva Conventions, conditions varied widely. Food was often scarce in the immediate post-war period when all of Europe faced shortages, and shelter was sometimes inadequate, particularly in the chaotic first months after Germany's surrender. American authorities alone held millions of German POWs in camps throughout Germany, housed in temporary facilities that ranged from converted military barracks to open-air enclosures surrounded by barbed wire. The Americans implemented a program of re-education designed to expose German soldiers to democratic values and confront them with evidence of Nazi crimes, including forcing them to watch documentary footage of concentration camp liberations. The effectiveness of these programs varied considerably, with some prisoners genuinely shocked by what they learned and others dismissing the evidence as Allied propaganda. Most German POWs held by Western powers were released relatively quickly, with the majority freed by 1947 or 1948. However, those suspected of war crimes or those deemed security risks faced longer detention, while Allied authorities investigated their wartime activities. For soldiers who had served on the Eastern Front or in occupation duties in areas where atrocities occurred, the screening process could extend their imprisonment, while investigators determined whether they had personal culpability for specific crimes. The issue of veteran welfare and recognition became increasingly contentious in West Germany during the 1950s as the country regained sovereignty and began building its own military forces. When West Germany established the Bundeswehr in 1955 as part of its integration into NATO, questions arose about whether former Wehrmacht and Waffen SS officers could serve in the new armed forces. The policy that emerged attempted to balance practical needs for experienced military leadership with political sensitivities about rehabilitating figures associated with Nazi crimes. Former Wehrmacht officers with clean records could join the Bundeswehr, and many did, bringing their professional expertise to the new democratic military. However, former Waffen SS officers faced stricter scrutiny. Records show that by September 1956, out of over 3,000 former Waffen SS applicants to the Bundeswehr, only about 500 were accepted. The rest were rejected due to ideological concerns, documented participation in atrocities, or pressure from Allied advisors who feared that accepting too many former SS men would taint the Bundeswehr's reputation. Those who were accepted typically kept quiet about their wartime service in the SS, understanding that their past remained controversial. Beyond official military and government structures, former soldiers found work throughout West German society during the economic recovery of the 1950s. Their military discipline, technical skills, and networks of comrades sometimes helped them secure employment in factories, construction, small businesses, or professional positions. The Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle of the 1950s, created opportunities for those willing to work hard and ask few questions about the past. However, social stigma lingered, particularly for former SS men, and many veterans avoided discussing their wartime service in detail, instead blending into the collective silence that characterized 1950s German society, when most Germans preferred to focus on rebuilding the future rather than confronting the past. This silence around wartime experiences became a defining feature of post-war German culture. Veterans returned from the war carrying traumatic memories, guilt, and loss, but social norms discouraged open discussion of these experiences. Families wanted to move forward, and broader society preferred narratives of victimhood, focusing on German suffering from Allied bombing campaigns and post-war hardships rather than German culpability for Nazi crimes. This collective amnesia allowed many veterans to avoid confronting their roles in the Nazi regime's atrocities, whether as direct perpetrators, enablers, or witnesses who failed to resist. The psychological costs of this silence were substantial, creating generational trauma that would only begin to be addressed decades later. For victims of Nazi aggression and the Holocaust, the rapid reintegration of former German soldiers into society felt like a profound betrayal of justice. Survivor. Organizations and left-leaning newspapers condemned policies that allowed men who had participated in or enabled atrocities to collect pensions and live comfortably, while many victims struggled to receive recognition or compensation. The moral complexity of this situation troubled many observers. How could a society claim to have confronted its past while simultaneously rehabilitating those who had carried out its crimes? Conservative outlets defended veteran welfare policies as necessary reconciliation and practical governance, arguing that punishing millions of ordinary soldiers who had followed orders would prevent social stability and economic recovery. Historians today note that economic reintegration often came long before any genuine moral reckoning with the Wehrmacht's complicity in Nazi crimes. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the false claim that the regular German military had fought honourably while remaining separate from Nazi political crimes, gained wide acceptance in 1950s West Germany, despite substantial evidence to the contrary. This myth served multiple purposes. It allowed veterans to maintain their self-respect and social standing. It facilitated West Germany's integration into Western military structures during the Cold War, and it enabled German society to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about widespread complicity in Nazi criminality. By the early 1960s, West Germany's economy was booming, and most former soldiers had successfully reintegrated into civilian life. Material prosperity helped ease some of the psychological burdens of defeat and loss, though it could never fully resolve the moral questions raised by participation in Nazi aggression. For many veterans, particularly former Waffen SS men who felt they had been unfairly vilified, resentment simmered beneath the surface of apparent normalization. Many believed they had been abandoned by the state they had served, denied proper recognition for their wartime sacrifice, and stigmatized for following orders in defense of their country. These grievances found organized expression through veterans' associations that became influential in West German politics and culture. In 1951, a group led by former Waffen SS generals Paul Hauser, Otto Kumm and Felix Steiner founded HIAG, the Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS, roughly translated as the Mutual Aid Association of former Waffen-SS members. HIAG started ostensibly as a welfare organization to support comrades denied state pensions and benefits, but it quickly evolved into something much larger and more controversial, a political lobby and revisionist historical movement. The organization's founders, articulate former generals with connections throughout German society, believed the Waffen-SS had been unfairly condemned as a criminal organization. Their central argument, simple but politically powerful, claimed that the Waffen-SS had been an apolitical fighting force, soldiers like any other who had fought bravely for Germany without involvement in or knowledge of Nazi political crimes. This narrative found a receptive audience in 1950s West Germany. Conservative politicians facing tight elections and eager to mobilize veterans' votes began courting HIAG and similar organizations. Chancellor Adenauer met privately with HIAG leaders, and prominent political figures addressed veteran rallies, lending legitimacy to their cause. Adenauer's 1953 public statement that Waffen-SS men had fought as soldiers just like others was partly the result of HIAG lobbying and reflected the political calculus that alienating hundreds of thousands of veterans and their families was politically risky. By the mid-1950s, HIAG had established branches across West Germany and claimed tens of thousands of members. The organization published magazines such as Der Freiwillige or The Volunteer, organized reunion events where former SS men could gather and reminisce about their wartime service, and even financed publication of memoirs that reframed SS divisions as elite military units rather than ideological enforcers of Nazi policy. Paul Hauser's 1953 book Soldaten wie andere auch, or Soldiers Like Any Other, became the cornerstone of this mythologizing effort, presenting the Waffen SS as honorable combatants unjustly maligned by victor's justice. HIAG's influence peaked in the 1960s when some former SS officers managed to secure public positions, and commemorative events for Waffen SS divisions were covered by local media without significant criticism. However, as Germany's younger generation began confronting the Nazi past more directly during the cultural upheavals of the late 1960s and early 1970s, public tolerance for revisionist narratives began to erode. Historians and journalists exposed HIAG's systematic efforts to minimize war crimes and rehabilitate the Waffen-SS's reputation. In 1978, a major investigation by Der Spiegel magazine revealed HIAG's deep political ties and documented attempts to pressure government officials regarding pension reforms and historical narratives. The scandal marked a turning point in HIAG's trajectory as mainstream political parties began distancing themselves from the organization, and its credibility weakened among the broader public. Nevertheless, the group remained active for another decade, sustained by aging veterans determined to defend their version of history and resist what they perceived as the unjust vilification of their wartime service. This resistance to historical accountability reflected deeper problems in how post-war German society had addressed questions of guilt and responsibility.